Good morning, friends and colleagues. I'm pleased to be here. I have asked Johannes to share my presentation with you. I prepared both. I couldn't decide whether I should do a PowerPoint or I should do a more interactive talk. So I prepared both, and you should receive them. I feel very much at home because I was born in the Western Cape, in Langa, grew up in Khayelitsha. I studied at this university, amongst others. Also studied at UCT, but now I'm based at the north. So it is. I'm always very happy to come back to the Western Cape and to come back to Stellenbosch. I not only studied here, but I also taught at the University of Stellenbosch for a while before I moved up north. So my talk will focus on shared value and the role of business in social change. It's a topic that is very close to my heart. I interact a lot with decision makers in business, interact a lot with government, do some work in advisory work with both government and business. I'm sure that you're very excited that we finally put together a trade deal that's going to at least create some certainty in the context of Brexit. The Minister of Trade and Industry announced a few days ago that at least we have in place a continuity agreement, and that's because without that, that could have been very disruptive for exporters. It could have created problems for the country because without such a trade deal, especially for the auto sector, it would have wiped out, I think, about 7 billion rands worth of export value to Britain. Back to I'm just referencing this because I used to work a lot on these issues when I was at the Department of Trade and Industry, driving the trade policy strategy. I've not done that for, I think, 12 years now, since I've left government. There have been calls recently for business to do much more than watching the single metrics of shareholder value, or just looking at the bottom line and looking at what we do on a day-to-day basis, but also to take a stakeholder view of society. I read recently a major report by the US Business Roundtable, where they place a great deal of emphasis on stakeholder capitalism. That businesses need to shift away from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And for many years, the US didn't buy into this idea of stakeholder capitalism. It was a European idea in the main. Milton Friedman, a very conservative economist, said the business of business is business. Any other thing is a waste of time. Businesses should be left to their own devices to do what they do best, to create quality products and services for society, to make profits, and any other thing doesn't belong to business. Since the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, which saw many workers in the West, in the Rust Belt in the US, losing their jobs, value wiped off the stock markets around the world, especially in the Western capital, and trade seizing up, growth flattening, calls intensified for businesses to do a lot more, especially because unemployment and inequalities started to grow bigger in many countries around the world. We had new movements springing up the 99% movement that occupied Wall Street. We had a rise of populist nationalism in the US and in much of Europe. So we had the pendulum, the ideological pendulum, shifting or moving from modernist, centrist politics to more radical, populist, nationalist politics. So under this climate, businesses a lot of people have put a great deal of attention on businesses, on corporates, to respond to socio-economic ills, for governments to do a lot more to respond to inequalities. So South Africa is not, in a sense, unique in this respect, except that we have a lot of legacy issues that remain unresolved in the country, issues related to economic inclusion, especially of the predominantly black segments of society, and louder calls for expropriation without compensation. There was a couple of years ago, around 2011 and 2012, calls made by the ANC Youth League within the ANC for banks to be nationalized, for every piece of land to be nationalized. In fact, when a group of leading figures in the Youth League was expelled in the ANC in 2012, in a process that was presided over by President Cyril Ramaphosa, it led to the creation of the EFF. That group was led by Julius Malema, and when they exited the ANC, they created the Economic Freedom Fighters. And since then, the tone of discourse in the country has been shifting to become a lot more radical. I agree with everything that Professor Karan said, except one thing about the ruling party. There was once a view that South African politics will always be centrist, will always be at the center. South Africans are not tolerant of extreme views or extreme political parties, and that we will never have populist nationalist parties that come to power. And this ignores history, because some of you who are familiar with history will realize that post World War I, when the group of elites that were in power at the time, General Jan Smuts and General Louis Botha, many communities who had suffered heavily during the Anglo-Boer War, had suffered drought, Afrikaners who were wandering in town looking for jobs. The land in the rural parts was unproductive, and Smuts was seen as becoming or turning more to the centrist view, closer to Britain, closer to English liberals, and this created deep resentment in South Africa and sown the seeds for the emergence of the Nationalist Party. So when a group of people, a constituency, an important, powerful constituency, feels ignored, feels left out in the margins, gradually populist nationalist politics take a center stage. We saw, especially in the last elections, 2014, when were the last elections? 2018, last year, or the year before. It feels a long time ago. Was it this year? Oh, it was this year. The two parties that made significant gains are not the ANC or the DA. Those parties saw decline for the first time since the last two elections. The two parties that registered very impressive gains were Freedom Front Plus and the Economic Freedom Fighters. And that tells us something about the political temperature in South Africa. You may say that, well, still, they are at 2% and 10%, but that's quite significant in a very short period of time, and in a country that has, for some time, championed modernist and centrist politics. So I wouldn't take it for granted. And also, I don't think necessarily that the answer to the future of South Africa lies in a revived ruling party. I think we should be a lot more imaginative about possibilities and prospects for new configurations in South Africa. We may not be able to imagine them fully, but there's no party that stays in power forever. It doesn't exist in the world. There's no such a thing. We saw recently, I think, we saw in many countries, in India, we saw in Argentina, we saw in Mexico at one point, in Thailand, parties that have been in power for decades, they simply collapse and crumble. In business, it's the same. We saw Bear Stearns that had existed for over 100 years, Lehman Brothers. So there's no party, and parties are not given by God. They are creatures of society, and at some point they fizzle and disappear. But it's for us to imagine new configurations that could be able to respond to the challenges of the day. Now back to the idea of shared value and social change. I think Professor Karan said quite a lot that I wanted to cover in terms of painting the picture of where we are as a country. And I want to communicate the idea that today, everywhere in every part of the world, and more so in South Africa, it's very clear that government on its own cannot solve the complex challenges that society faces. Not only government, but no single stakeholder today can solve all the challenges, the wicked problems that he referred to. These are complex, these are problems without easy answers, these are problems without clear definition, and these are problems that require collaboration among different stakeholders. And business has a greater responsibility because of the relative resources, the relative capabilities that it possesses. As I said when I started, the business of business is no longer just business, especially in a country like South Africa. There is much more that businesses can do. And I'm going to touch on this in a while. Without a doubt, owners, managers have to place emphasis on building sustainable businesses, producing high quality products and services, be innovative, deliver shareholder value, ensure return on equity, and so on. This is necessary, but certainly not sufficient for creating long-term social and economic stability, which is the basis for sustainable business in the long run. So I see this as enlightened self-interest, because if we do all we can to try and solve the problems that are there in society, to try and respond to social ills, to work with stakeholders, including business and communities, we are creating a better future, not just for ourselves, but also for our children and grandchildren. So it really is to leave a bequest to the future. But if we decide that we are going to be blind to these challenges and these problems, or they are not our problems, someone else has to solve them. I think that's a very it's a level of selfishness that has long-term implications for future generations when we are not here. Because what we're saying is that they will see for themselves how they solve problems that we chose not to solve because we were short-termist in our approach. We're not even selfish, we're short-termist, because if we were selfish, we would at least try and buy the future for our children and our challenges. I would like to underline 4 key areas that I think constitute the major wicked problems for us today in South Africa. One is that of growing inequalities and high levels of unemployment. The recent numbers are quite alarming at 29%. They should not be shocking because we've seen the trends in the last few years. We've known that the economy is not growing. We've known that the levels of investments are low. Business confidence is not where it should be. It's negative. And one of the things that are baffling for me is that whenever new figures are released, the first reaction of politicians is that I am shocked, I am surprised. I'm sure you've seen this. You know, if something happens or violence happens, social tensions flare up. Politicians say, we are shocked that people have been living this way. So we are at 29% unemployment. Levels of inequality are very high. In one of the slides, I show a picture cover of a Time magazine that showed the stark contrast in South Africa in the levels of wealth and how people live. And I always say that there are 2 things that are likely to undermine or sink South Africa if they are not attended to with urgency. One is inequality. And this is multidimensional because it's structural. It also has to do with the inability of entrepreneurs, especially small-scale entrepreneurs, black entrepreneurs, to access capital or to access value chains or to integrate into value chains because of the concentrated structure of the South African economy. The second related point is that of a stagnant economy that has high levels of concentration by large firms, a point that I've just alluded to. Many SMMEs are battling to supply products and services to the economy because it's highly concentrated. And if you look at the work of the Competition Commission in this area, where they've had to fine businesses for anti-competitive behavior or impose public interest conditions during mergers and acquisitions, as well as reports by your OECD or your IMF or special reports by the World Bank. This area has been flagged a lot. That the South African economy is highly concentrated. And it's not productive, it's not competitive, it's not making way to new entrants that could create large number of jobs, that could yield new entrepreneurs. The third challenge is that of a weak public administration. One of the things that are often overlooked in South Africa is that there's a brain drain in government currently, where skills are shifting from government to the private sector and the non-state sector. And this creates problems for public service delivery because you need skills to build the country, you need skills to build the economy, you need skills to direct economic change, you need skills to respond to all these challenges that are out there. Part of the problem that has led to non-implementation of some of the policies related to land reform are to do with weak skills in government. If you go to the Department of DEF, what used to be called DEF, the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, that's one problem that confronts you. You do have pockets of skills, perhaps in very technical areas to do with maybe sanitary and phytosanitary measures and other more technical issues. Recently joked with the former head of the budget office at the National Treasury, Michael Sachs, who's now a colleague at Wits. And we're at a meeting where we're talking about challenges facing South African economy. And I made this point. I said, well, Michael should not be here. He should be at National Treasury. He's part of the problem because he's left government and the thing is limping. But it's a reality. I see many people who used to work in government at very high level, and it's very difficult to create a skill, a technical skill at a top level. It takes years in any sector that you go to, not just in government. And this, in my view, is one of the major risks for turning around this economy and delivering services to the public, as well as getting a handle on high levels of inequality. The fourth element has to do with market failure. The idea that the private sector wants to be left alone. They want to do as little as possible to contributing to social change. That initiatives that you see in the private sector are half-hearted. They are of compliance type, even on black economic empowerment type initiatives. It's about compliance. Companies are paying a lot of money to verification agencies to get these levels, level 1, 2, whatever. The ruling idea or ruling sort of thinking on empowerment and transformation sadly has become about regulatory compliance, about checking boxes and please leave us alone. Here is a verification report. We good. But we don't look at the real impact. No one does monitoring and evaluation or audit of real change that beneficiaries of these programs receive, or people would create some training programs, many training programs, and sort of account these training programs for accounting purposes. But whether or not they really create value in the economy, they create value for the individuals who are receiving these or who are sort of beneficiaries of these programs, where do these schemes go? What happens thereafter? Is there a tracking mechanism to see where those people go? What happened to that CSI community initiative and so on? I really believe that the only way we're going to build and sustain momentum for positive change is through shared value. When organizations choose to be aloof, focus on limited matrix of shareholder value, and ignore broader societal stakeholders, they lose their license to operate. I also don't think that in adopting shared or transformation as a form of shared value, one has to necessarily agree with the ideology of the ruling party or of government. One thing whenever I meet with executives of large corporates who complain about government regulation or complain about differences over, say, the mining charter or one form of charter or another, the question I like to pose is, has your sector formulated its own plan proactively to present to government and say, this is our plan? It's a comprehensive plan. We've co-designed it with stakeholders, we've co-designed it with communities, we've co-designed it with workers. We've tested elements of this plan and we think this is the best plan that can take this sector forward. You don't find that. Instead, you find reaction to regulation. And if we're honest, many of the battery of regulations that we see, especially around empowerment and transformation, would not have been necessary at all, would not have happened at all, had the private sector proactively managed empowerment, proactively managed transformation, proactively went before government and say, here is what we propose to do. I know that this doesn't affect you because there are these round tables, fresh produce round tables, vegetable round tables, and conversations there are probably quite far ahead. But this is what I encounter when I talk to decision makers in large corporate firms in the private sector. People don't care about stakeholder impact. They don't care about social and economic inclusion. They don't care about whether the money, they're happy to throw money to a couple of problems, but they never go and measure and think proactively on how best to create results. And I agree fully with Professor Karan. A lot of what needs to be done, which I noted in my presentation, are not big bang ideas or big bang plans or big bang approaches, but localized solutions. And solutions that work, that can be measured, that can be evaluated, that can be tested, and that can be innovated. So at times we think about change in macro view, but it's got to make a big splash. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to fit the ideology of the ruling party or the EFF. It's just got to be real. It's just got to be purposeful, and it's just got to be measured for impact. Now, I think there are many things that can be done. People often ask, what should we do? I think there are many things that can be done. I think, first of all, we should not over-exaggerate the problem or the level of contribution that is required from us. There has to be a sense of urgency, yes. There has to be a sense of purposefulness, yes, but we don't have to over-exaggerate the scale of the problem or what is required of us to make a contribution to the challenge. Because there are many other stakeholders, there are many other entities, there are many other players. The question is, what is it that we can do at the local scale and in relation to our immediate stakeholders, the workers, the suppliers or potential suppliers in the communities, and those who could get an opportunity to go through university or training programs that are real and credible, such as the case that was highlighted by Professor Karan. I think the starting point should be questions that point to general principles. What do we believe about transformation? What is it that we believe genuinely about transformation? What is our philosophy of transformation? And again, I want to emphasize that this does not have to approximate that of the ruling party, because it's a contested concept, it's a contested terrain, and the idea really is to find pathways to doing things differently, to contributing to social value or to creating social value. What components of transformation are important for us and for the beneficiaries or potential partners that we work with? What kind of actions should we be taking, and how should we sequence such actions? The fourth question, how do we align shared value with our business strategy? Because if you do things that are completely unrelated to your work as fresh produce farmers or exporters or logistics companies, of the value chain, whether you sort of primary or somewhere in the value chain, you will not be emotionally hooked to it. It just doesn't make sense. You're doing things that are completely unrelated. And I think solutions for creating social change should lie within your space. It should be about really creating quality human capital. The next layer of workers in the agricultural sector that are highly skilled. The next layer of managers who are black and highly skilled. The next layer of capital owners in the sector that are mentored from early age until they can run their own businesses in the sector. It has to be about thinking of shared value with respect to making sure that the land is productively used, that there is food security in the sector grows and becomes competitive. And if we are honest, the sector cannot grow and become competitive on the basis of a tiny group of entrepreneurs or of few participants. We may sustain for maybe the next decade or two, but with the pressures building in South Africa, with resentment accentuating, and with inequalities and levels of exclusion becoming a lot more prominent, we know that the status quo will at some point lose steam and rupture. So if we begin today, and if we are able to showcase examples, and we don't do it for regulatory checkbox, but we do it because we believe in it, we embrace in it, we are emotionally invested in it, we care about the sector, we care about its future, I think we will have some success. And once we get this out of the way, we are able to have really exciting and fulfilling conversations about how do we become competitive as a sector, how do we open up new markets, how do we position the sector differently in a changing world, how do we respond to geopolitical shifts in the world in ways that benefits the sector, how do we think about the role of technology as a catalyst for growth in the sector. While these other issues remain unresolved, we'll simply not have the mental energy and the clarity of focus to take this sector to another level. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that, in my view, shared value as transformation is not something that has an ultimate destination per se, especially if you see it as an imperative that is not just about equity or management, but broadening the base of the economic sector, training and developing a new layer of human capital, and enhancing growth and competitiveness of the sector. So we see it as a total picture. And I think we must never fall into the trap of seeing transformation or shared value contributing to social change as about changing equity structures, from black to white to black, or bringing in some black partners you've never met, you've never known from a bar of soap, you don't know their capabilities, you just want to be BE. I mean, there was that trend, and I think it's losing, that type of empowerment is losing credibility. I don't buy into it because it has severe limits. It's not necessarily creating new value in the economy. It tends to enrich lawyers and bankers more than anyone else, and it's a very narrow-minded view, unless of course you've been working your workers. There's some really promising potential, or amongst your suppliers, you could do business with them as you would have done with any partner who would have created value, and then you kind of explore those. But there is this unfortunate phenomenon in South Africa that equates empowerment to just narrow equity type BEE. Finally, there is no easy way of doing transformation or expressing shared value in the context of solving South Africa's evolving and tough challenges. A magic formula does not exist, but it's something that we've got to do. Inaction is not an option. It has severe implications for the future. I will leave it at that. Thanks.